Hello everyone, today we will step into a ballroom of flickering candles and whispering masks, where velvet hides blades and every smile may conceal a death sentence. It is the year 1792. The chandeliers in Stockholm's Royal Opera House glow like stars, casting long shadows upon powdered wigs and embroidered waistcoats. Music rises, laughter floats, and eyes dart above silk masks, each face both known and unknowable. In this crowd walks a king, cloaked in disguise but unmistakable to those who seek his end. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, share your thoughts in the comments. Was Gustav III a visionary monarch, or a man too blind to see his own fall? The invitation had been lavish. A masquerade ball to celebrate Lent, held on a Friday night when the chill of early spring still clung to the streets. Carriages rumbled toward the opera house, carrying the cream of Swedish nobility. Inside, everything glittered: gold-gilded balconies, marble floors, musicians with powdered faces and stiff, elegant posture. The guests arrived masked, of course, per custom. But this time, it meant more than mere theatrics. King Gustav III arrived late, fashionably so. His mask was black velvet with silver trim, matching the regal but modest cut of his costume. Though the monarch had disguised himself, few could truly mistake him. Gustav was tall, carried himself with theatrical flair, and his manner of movement, graceful, studied, was unlike any other man in the room. People bowed, murmured compliments, and cleared space in his wake, even if his identity was meant to be a secret. The king enjoyed the performance, playing the part of a man both hidden and exposed. But beneath the polished floorboards, beneath the courtesies and music, there was tension, real and sharp. For months, Gustav had sensed it. His reforms, though hailed by some, had made enemies among the nobility. He had centralized royal power, weakened the aristocracy, and restructured Swedish governance. It was not simply discontent, it was contempt, rooted in class, tradition, and wounded pride. The king had been warned. Letters, anonymous and bitter, had made their way into his hands. One in particular, received just days before the ball, chilled him more than he admitted. "Do not attend the masquerade," it read. "Death walks behind your mask." And yet he came. Gustav was not just a king, he was a showman, a patron of the arts, a dramatist who saw the world in acts and crescendos. To avoid the ball would be cowardice. Worse, it would give credence to the threats. And so, flanked by guards but mingling freely, Gustav took to the floor with a confident, unhurried air. As music swirled, so too did the dancers. Spinning, laughing, toasting with sparkling wine. Conversations bloomed behind fans and masks. Yet even here Gustav could feel it, that sliver of cold silence in the corners of the room. Eyes watching too closely. Movements too rehearsed. A handful of masked men stayed near the outer edges of the crowd, never straying far from each other. He noticed, but said nothing. To accuse without evidence would be to weaken himself, and that he could not afford. The hours pressed forward. Candles burned lower, the orchestra played on. Gustav stood briefly alone near a column, sipping from a crystal glass, when he felt a presence behind him. The voice that spoke was low, firm, and unmistakably controlled. "Sire! You should not linger." It was Count Karl Horn, loyal to the core, eyes darting nervously toward the masked faces hovering near the gallery's edge. Gustav nodded, smiled faintly, and dismissed him with a hand. Always calm. Always composed. But the air had changed. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed midnight. The king took another step into the crowd, toward the masked faces, toward the unknown. And they were waiting. The candlelight shimmered on 100 masks, and for a moment, the scene was one of surreal beauty, a living painting of silks, shadows, and soft laughter. Yet beneath it all, a current ran, something dark, electric, and nearly imperceptible. Gustav III, though outwardly poised, had begun to feel it creep into his chest, a sensation he could neither name nor shake. The conspirators had waited for this night with growing impatience. For months they had nursed their outrage in salons and parlors, passing letters between hands clenched with fury. They believed Gustav had betrayed the nobility, insulted the traditions of the kingdom, and turned Sweden into his personal stage. Some whispered of tyranny, others of humiliation. But all agreed on one thing: the king had to die. Among them was Jacob Johann Ankerström. Once a captain of the Royal Guards, now stripped of honor and seething with resentment, Ankerström had been approached quietly. At first, he balked at the idea of regicide. But each conversation, each carefully phrased suggestion, each knowing glance had peeled away his hesitation like the layers of an onion. Soon, he was not just willing, he was eager. He wore a dark domino mask and a simple black cloak. He blended easily into the crowd of similarly dressed nobles, their masks protecting both status and identity. Ankerström had one advantage above all: he knew how to move within the court. He understood how the king walked, where he paused, who he trusted. He knew the rhythm of Gustav's presence, and more importantly, he knew the moment to strike. The plan was as delicate as it was brutal. The conspirators would wait until Gustav was away from his guards, near enough to be approached without suspicion. They had memorized his costume, his mask. When the time came, Ankerström would step forward, press close, and fire. The others would vanish into the crowd. And then chaos. For now, they hovered like vultures at the edge of a feast. They sipped wine, exchanged false pleasantries, and waited for the music to drown out the silence of intent. Back in the center of the ballroom, Gustav moved with courtly grace, exchanging brief words with a diplomat from France, nodding politely to a group of merchants. But the mask no longer amused him. It felt too tight, too warm. The whispers, he could hear them now, or at least imagine them. And each time he turned, he caught the flick of a glance away, the parting of a group of men who did not wish to be recognized. He made his way toward a side corridor, briefly, casually, seeking air. A glass of punch was offered, and he accepted it without tasting. Behind him, shadows shifted. Elsewhere, the conspirators adjusted their positions. The moment was close. They had seen Gustav move beyond his usual circle of guards. They had marked the precise spot, just beyond the red velvet drapes, beside the tall column, where the music did not quite reach. Ankerström slipped his hand into the folds of his cloak. His fingers touched cold steel, the pistol, loaded and primed. Another man caught his eye and gave the slightest nod. Now. As Gustav re-entered the main hall from the corridor, he passed near a gathering of masked figures who appeared deep in conversation. One detached from the group. Black cloak. Slow steps. Confident. The king turned slightly, sensing movement. Bonsoir, votre majesté, the man whispered, voice muffled by his mask. Before Gustav could respond, he felt a hand press firmly to his side, far too close, far too familiar. Then came the flash. A blinding burst of fire and smoke erupted between them, accompanied by a sharp, terrible crack. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then came the screams. Gustav staggered backward, eyes wide, the front of his coat already blooming with blood. The sound of the shot echoed through the ballroom like a thunderclap, ricocheting off marble and glass. Musicians dropped their instruments. Guests shrieked and stumbled, masks falling from startled faces. Panic erupted like a dam breaking. The attacker vanished into the blur of movement. The conspirators, as planned, melted into the chaos, their expressions hidden, their names unspoken. But the king did not fall. He stood, trembling, gripping his side. Blood soaked his glove as he raised a hand to his mouth. Around him, guards surged forward, weapons drawn, searching wildly for the assailant. "Seal the doors!" someone bellowed. And amid the uproar, The monarch who had loved the theater realized he was now the dying star of his final act. The moment the shot rang out, time shattered. Gasps turned to screams, laughter to sobs, and the splendor of the masquerade dissolved into terror. The orchestra froze mid-note. A goblet shattered against the floor. Feathered masks and powdered wigs fell away as guests surged toward the exits in blind panic. But the doors had been ordered sealed, on Gustav's command or someone else's, it wasn't clear. The grand hall was suddenly a gilded cage. And at the center stood the king. Gustav III, still upright, swayed like a man walking through fog. Blood oozed between his fingers, staining the gold buttons of his coat a deep, ugly crimson. His eyes darted across the room, wide, confused, alert. He knew he had been shot. He knew what that meant. But part of him, some fragment deep inside, refused to accept it. He did not cry out. He did not fall. 2 guards rushed to his side, catching him just as his knees buckled. They eased him to the floor near the marble pillar, where crimson already pooled beneath his body. Gustav's breath was shallow, his lips pale. "Find him," he murmured, barely audible. "The man in black." Around them, the crowd surged. Noblemen trampled one another in their haste to escape, some still clutching their masks as if dignity might shield them. Women wept into their sleeves, crying for help, for their husbands, for God. The scent of gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with perfume, wax, and fear. But the killer was gone, disappeared into the masquerade's unraveling fabric. Ankerstrom had fled as planned, pushing through the chaos with calculated desperation. In the mayhem, every man in a black cloak was suspect, and there were many. He had tossed the pistol aside within moments, hidden beneath a table skirt. The smoke still lingered when he reached the gallery, slipping into a crowd of terrified guests. Still, he was not safe. Nor was he calm. His heart thudded against his ribs. This was no longer conspiracy or fantasy. It was murder, and it had happened. What came next was not triumph but uncertainty. Would the king live? Would he talk? Would someone name him? He had expected a kind of righteous satisfaction. Instead, he felt only cold. Back on the ballroom floor, the king was being lifted, carefully, by 4 men. His mask had been removed, his face pale, streaked with sweat. One of the guards held the monarch's limp hand, whispering assurances either of them believed. The bullet had entered low in the back, lodging deep. It had missed his spine but struck close to the kidney. The wound was not instantly fatal, but it was grave. A litter was brought hastily, and Gustav was carried through a shocked and silent hall. No music now. No laughter. Just whispers and the hurried shuffle of footsteps. Outside, snow fell gently onto the carriage roof as he was loaded in and rushed toward the palace. The masquerade had ended, not with a bow, but with blood. Within hours, Stockholm trembled. Word spread quickly: the king had been shot. Speculation spiraled. Had he died already? Was it a French plot? A noble revolt? In truth, no one knew yet. But fear is a fast horse, and it rode hard that night. In the palace, Gustav was laid in his private chamber. Curtains were drawn. Doctors summoned. Candles lit. The bullet had not exited, and probing only caused agony. The wound was deep, the bleeding steady. Fever followed quickly. Still, he clung to life. In those first hours, Gustav drifted in and out of consciousness. At times he was lucid, whispering names, recalling details. At others he raved, half-remembered lines from plays, conversations with long-dead friends, fragments of prayer. He was aware of his condition, even joked bitterly to his surgeon. "Another masquerade, perhaps, but I doubt I'll dance again." Outside the palace, soldiers patrolled the streets. Arrests began. Every noble who had been at the ball was questioned. The pistol was found, eventually traced to Ankerstrom. Under interrogation, first gentle, then brutal, he cracked. He named names. Count Ribbing, Baron Pechlin. Other disgruntled aristocrats who had met in secret, plotted in whispers, toasted in wine-soaked defiance. The conspiracy was larger than Gustav had feared, and it was rooted deep within the very class he had tried to tame. But none of it mattered more than one question. Would the king survive? Each day brought new rumors. Gustav was recovering. No, he was dying. No, he had already died. In truth, he lingered caught between two worlds, his fate uncertain. And still, outside the palace gates, the snow kept falling. The days that followed were neither swift nor merciful. Gustav III, monarch of Sweden, lay in his darkened chamber, suspended in a half-life. His breath rattled in his chest. The wound had festered as the physicians, despite their silks and solemn titles, could do little more than apply leeches and utter helpless prayers. They dared not dig too deep for the bullet. Their instruments were crude. Their knowledge, more ceremony than science. Outside the chamber, the palace corridors were hushed. Servants moved like ghosts. Courtiers gathered in tight knots, speaking in whispers, glancing over their shoulders. No one knew what to say. No one wanted to be seen celebrating, or grieving, too early. Each hour brought conflicting reports. "The king has taken broth," someone said. "His pulse is stronger." Then later, "He is delirious again. He thinks it is his coronation." The truth sat somewhere in between. Gustav drifted, lucid at times, distant at others. He spoke to portraits on the wall. He dictated letters no one could understand. Once, he ordered the court musician to prepare a fanfare for the morning. There would be no fanfare. Still, he held on. And in the midst of his suffering, the machinery of justice ground forward. Jacob Johann Ankerström had been captured, unmasked, and flung into a damp cell beneath the royal palace. The confession came quickly. He did not beg. He did not weep. His voice, when it came, was cold and matter-of-fact. Yes, he had fired the shot. Yes, he had conspired. Yes, he believed the king's rule had become tyranny. No, he did not regret his actions. But with the pain of infection eating away at him, Gustav found no triumph in vengeance. He asked, instead, for the names of the others involved. He wanted to know who had poisoned the court, who had smiled at him by candlelight while plotting his end in secret. The names flowed like a tide. Ribbing, Horn, Liljenspar. Some confessed. Others fled. One noble threw himself from a bridge before the guards reached his door. The monarchy, for all its splendor, had been a house of cards, and now Gustav saw just how thin the mortar had been. On the 5th day, a priest was summoned. Gustav asked to hear Massachusetts. When the litany began, he closed his eyes and mouthed the words, his lips trembling. Later that evening, he called for his son, Crown Prince Gustav Adolf. The boy, barely 13, stood silently by the bed, stiff in formal dress. Gustav reached for him with a shaking hand, touching the boy's cheek, memorizing his face. "Be stronger than I was," he whispered. "Wear the crown with caution." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Forgive, when you can. But never forget." The room was quiet. The fire burned low. And still, he lingered. At midnight, a storm broke over Stockholm. The windows trembled with wind. The sky cracked with lightning. It was as if the heavens themselves had come to witness the end of a man who had ruled like a dramatist, performed like a monarch, and now died like a man, slowly, painfully, and alone. By morning, his skin was ashen. His breath came in fits. The fever surged one last time, and then silence. Gustav III died on March 29, 1792, 13 days after the masquerade. His death did not come in a blaze of glory, nor in the arms of his people. It came in the quiet dimness of a chamber cloaked in velvet and fear. A bullet had killed him, But it was the betrayal behind it that had truly ended him. Outside, bells began to toll. The king was dead. And a kingdom held its breath. The bells of Stockholm tolled through the dawn mist, their slow, hollow chimes echoing off stone walls and frozen rooftops. Across the city, people paused. Some crossed themselves, some wept, and others simply stood still, unsure whether to mourn or breathe a cautious sigh of relief. King Gustav III was dead. The announcement, made officially by the Council of the Realm, was brief. It offered no embellishments, no poetry, just the fact, delivered like a blade: His Majesty, Gustav III, had succumbed to his wounds. But the masquerade's echoes did not die with him. In the days that followed, Sweden's noble class began to unravel in earnest. Gustav's death had not just decapitated a monarchy, it had exposed the fault lines beneath an entire political order. The conspiracy was wider than expected. Names spilled from interrogations like rot from a cracked cask. Trials were swift. Executions followed. Jacob Johan Ankerström, the man who pulled the trigger, was sentenced to die in the most public and symbolic way the crown could devise. He was flogged across several days in the public square, his noble blood offered up for display. Then came the final act. He was beheaded with a single stroke of the axe, his body dismembered, and his remains scattered beyond the city walls. Justice, or vengeance, had been served. But blood does not wash away discontent. Gustav's son, the young Gustav IV Adolf, ascended the throne under a regency. The boy was too young, too soft-spoken, too uncertain to inherit his father's storm. The real power fell to the nobles Gustav III had once tried to tame. And so, like shadows reclaiming the room after the candle has burned low, the aristocracy returned to power. What Gustav had built, his vision of enlightened absolutism, his reforms, his theater of monarchy, began to fray. Laws were overturned. Alliances shifted. The court grew quiet, almost paranoid. And always, there was the memory of the masquerade. It lingered in every corner of the opera house, in every royal banquet, in every whispered warning: beware what hides behind the mask. Yet even in death, Gustav III left a mark. He had been, by turns, brilliant and blind. His love for drama and spectacle made him a monarch of myth, but perhaps also a man who mistook applause for affection. He had ruled with vision, yes, but not always with tact. He had dreamed of transforming Sweden into a modern, cultural beacon. And for a time, he had. Under his reign, the arts flourished. Architecture soared. Opera houses opened. French fashion and philosophy took root in the cold Nordic soil. But the nobility had not forgotten the price of their clipped wings. And so they had waited, plotted, and struck, not on a battlefield, but in a ballroom. The masquerade itself became legend. It was said that the candle that lit Gustav's final steps never went out. That guests at future balls heard a gunshot that no one else heard. That masked figures sometimes appeared near the opera house only to vanish when approached. Superstition, perhaps. Or maybe the guilt of a city still trying to make peace with its own performance. Years later, a playwright would stage a version of the assassination, on Ballo and Mascara. In it, a masked king is warned, ignores the omen, and is shot at a ball. Audiences applauded. The story was a tragedy, a caution, a curiosity. But in Stockholm, it was memory. The king who had loved theater had become its final act. Not on a stage, but on a ballroom floor, beneath golden chandeliers and painted ceilings. Shot not in war, but in the midst of waltz and wine. Betrayed not by foreign enemies, but by men who once swore fealty with polished shoes and powdered wigs. And though the crown passed on, the wound remained. Every masquerade in Sweden, from that day forward, bore a silent shadow. Behind every mask, perhaps, the ghost of a king. Listening. Watching. Waiting for the moment the music stops.